Oh, it's a pleasure being here. After doing about 120 days on the road last year, none of them was in Belfast. And so it's a pleasure to get here finally. It's my first time presenting in Belfast, which is it's a pleasure to be here. I normally do about 80, 90 conferences a year around the world. And I share a lot of my research, my penetration testing, a lot of my experiences with actually doing penetration testing and also advisory for critical infrastructure. So what I like to do is take you on a bit of a journey. What I try to do is basically take you into my mind and share with you some of the thought process that goes through a penetration tester or ethical hacker's mind when they're carrying out these tasks and activities. Because one of my beliefs is that actually the best way, is for you to understand hacker techniques and hacker processes, because it gives you the understanding about how they target you, what things they do to abuse your security, and ways that they're able to gain access to organizations and sensitive information. So understanding these techniques is one of the best ways to understand how you become a target and what things that they will actually try to expose in order to gain access. Now, a few years ago, I've been in the industry for now more than 25, coming on 30 years. I know I look young, and you're thinking, how is that possible? But I started my actually first job back here in Belfast in 1993, working at the Royal Victoria Hospital doing a data transformation for medical records. That's where I started my career back here. And across the time, working with critical infrastructure, doing penetration testing, one of the things that I do is like to share those processes. And a few years ago, I was approached by a particular government who had basically just set out a new kind of process to understand the resiliency in some of the critical infrastructure. And I came across with a challenge that was asked me to, can I do a penetration test in a power station? And what better to setting me up this morning was, of course, with Kieran's presentation this morning and discussions around PLCs and city resilience, that what better way for me to show you how hackers and cyber criminals actually gain access to those systems. Sometimes you think that it's going through the most difficult and the sophisticated and advanced techniques. But in most cases, it's the most simplest, easiest process in order to gain access. And we typically take the least noisy, and the easiest path and the least cost as well to gain access. So one of the things, when I was given this challenge, I probably jumped too quickly. I should have sat back and I should have thought more about it before accepting it. Because originally, the reason why I accepted doing this challenge of penetration into power station was that my background, I've spent years doing penetration testing on ships and shipping manufacturers. And my mind was, I thought, this is going to be easy because I've done so much of this before. It's the same engines, they're just different, they're not V shapes, they're basically square shapes. And that it's the same PLCs, it's the same control systems, same SCADAs. And what even better, because I get horribly seasick. And when I was doing penetration testing, I was throwing up more on these ships than I would have wished. But I was thinking that, fantastic, it's just another ship, but it's on land. So I was excited, but the realization then set in when I actually started doing the preparation and the planning for the penetration test itself. Now, before getting into the details, I have this explicitly say that I was only given permission to talk about this last October. The penetration test itself was actually more than 4 years ago, and it was actually on a modern, sophisticated power station. The images in this presentation do not represent the vendors that were discovered and the vulnerabilities that were discovered during the tests. So it's important to note that these are not representations of the vendors. I'm not allowed to talk about the country, the power station, nor the vendors at all. The only reason I'm being given permission is to talk about the process and techniques that was used, and also that I had to wait until the power station itself had actually put the right resilience and security controls in place to mitigate the vulnerabilities discovered. One of the reasons I'm not allowed to talk about the vendors is it's not necessary, meaning that other power stations have went through the same techniques and processes to secure their facilities as well. So as I was going through this in the preparation and planning, what I realized was that a power station is very different from a ship. I started realizing that the security is a lot different. Ships were easier accessible, especially when they're at port, when they're near shore. You could use a lot of things with communications and SDRs. But with the challenges of a power station, typically I was not able to go anywhere near the power station. There was actually a no man zone that was surrounding it. There was actually sand covering it. There was high fences. I couldn't use drones in order to fly overhead to start looking at it, even putting hotspots in it to try and see if I can scan for Wi-Fi access points. I couldn't do any of that. I even couldn't go near the power station in order to do the planning and preparation. And I started getting concerned into what I really got into. because yes, I had done the engines and SCADA controls before in shipping, but now I ran into a much more challenging scenario when I was faced with the power station. So I put it aside. I said, okay, that's a challenge and risk I have to deal with as I go through this process. I'm just going to start my normal routine of penetration testing in order to start, basically going through the next phases. Now, step one is the most important phase in penetration testing. This is the planning, the reconnaissance, the passive assessment. And actually, it's probably the most forgotten thing that most penetration testers and ethical hackers and cyber criminals do. It's the most critical task. And one thing is, not many people talk about it. You hear a lot about the after the fact, when people gain access or when they gain access to the systems or they compromise vulnerabilities and so forth. But this is the most crucial stage. 90% of my time is actually spent doing this. This is where I go on to things like websites, YouTube, videos, pictures, websites for job recruiting agencies, and looking at the resumes, looking at the social media of the employees. I create a digital blueprint of the target without even touching any of their infrastructure, without even going onto their website. I basically am able to do a lot of digital footprinting from the public information, pulling back what types of security skills they're looking for in employees, what types of hardware that they're using, the blueprints, the actually vendors and suppliers that they have. I was able to then download the schematics, download the actually emulation software for the SCADA control systems. One is I couldn't purchase it. I didn't have enough money to purchase those things, quite expensive. So I had to rely on things like emulators and actually documentation. So during this phase, I was able to gather a large enough footprint and understanding about the target into basically the staff, their children, their jobs, their hobbies, their phone numbers, the cars that they drive, where they park, the cafes they go to when they actually have their lunch. I was able to start predicting what people were going to be doing in the future with the data that you gather during this stage. Now, if you do this correctly, the next phase is quite easy. Normally, it's a 24 to 48 hour gaining access. Now, again, this raises another problem, is that when I'm typically doing a gaining access, I will typically use something like a phishing campaign or phishing scam. Now, when I do this, the problem was in the power station, I came into some number of challenges. Now, that in a power station, it was an auxiliary power station, there wasn't a lot of staff to target. So therefore, what I didn't want to be able to do is actually raise awareness, raise alarms. Normally, I would have went through something like this. This was a well-known phishing campaign that happened in Gmail a few years ago. Was simply, it looked like an attachment, and when people click on the attachment, it simply takes them to a login page, and they basically give over their credentials. This is the one and the path that most cyber criminals and hackers will use, is basically get you as humans to trust me enough, or to basically look like something is normal and something expected, and you give me the credentials and give me access to the systems. Rather than me spending time trying to actually crack passwords and hack into them, I simply just go as you. Now, one that I was actually planning for this particular one, which was very successful a few years ago, was that I was giving a bet by a government that actually bet me a bottle of wine and whiskey whether I could do a phishing campaign that was 100% successful. And I thought, you know what, I always like a challenge. I like a bottle of wine and not so much whiskey. So I took it on, and I came up with a phishing campaign, which is similar to the one I was going to use for the power station, which was basically issuing speeding tickets. So one of the things about speeding tickets is that you're abusing people's trust and fear. You're pulling off certain aspects of human ability in order to get them to do what you want them to do. Of course, doing this, it meant that it was very time limited, that I didn't have an extended amount of time in order to do it, because once you trigger it, you have a limited time before somebody notifies the IT or security team. What you're doing is you're playing off people's basically the time urgency, of fear of being illegal. No one wants to be basically doing something that's unlawful, and also there's a money impact. When we actually issued this speeding tickets, it was 5:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. Why 5:30? Is people started to go home, and the transportation agency, which actually had the contact details and speeding tickets, was closed at 5 p.m. So 5:30, people got the speeding tickets. They had no way to verify it. They called out the number. It was actually the correct details. Said, our office hours are Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Please call back Monday. And now they're faced with a speeding ticket. And they're thinking, and in the speeding ticket was, if you don't acknowledge and verify the speeding ticket in 24 hours, the fine doubles. In 48 hours, it triples. So now you have this urgency as people thinking about, well, do you know what, I will verify it and check it out. We had a 99% success rate by the Sunday evening. Monday morning, we were high-fiving because we thought we were going to get 100%. And Monday morning was still 99. And I got really furious because because I'm such a perfectionist. I like to do things really well. And I went in and I demanded, I want to talk to the one person who didn't click on the link. I want to know who that is. So I actually got the interview, the person, I sat down, I said, we went through this plan, we thought we'd done it really well, that who was this one person that didn't click on the link? And I asked, so why didn't you click on the link? And I said, well, I went home 5 o'clock Friday, turned off my phone, didn't check my email till Monday morning. So some of the lessons you learn is, if you can control email during high critical times, you can actually reduce the impact of your organization significantly. And then, of course, we looked at Verizon Data Breach Investigation report that came out yesterday. And email continues to be the #1 method of actually gaining access and deploying and doing these. Now, when I was faced with this and I was planning it, during my reconnaissance phase, what I do is I call these attack paths. The attack paths tell me the most highly success method of gaining access. And my attack path told me that phishing campaign was not going to work. It was too noisy, and that the actually staff basically had already went through cyber awareness training in the past year, so therefore they were likely to raise awareness to the team knowing that I was going to come, and basically that somebody was trying to gain access. So I actually had to come up with a different plan. This is where basically during attacks you have to actually look at your attack paths, look at what's most noisy, what's the least risk, when you're going to be able to have the most success. And during the attack planning that I was doing, I realized that this was not going to work. This was going to have to actually go lower in my plan, and I had to come up with something different. And the different thing was that I actually had to go through supply chain. Supply chain was my next path. It was actually going through basically getting a job in the power station as a maintenance or a cleaner or some type of supplier, which meant actually going with a third-party organization. And I actually started applying for jobs. I was going on the websites and applying for jobs to get access physically into the power station. And then this opportunity came along that I found out that actually power station was going to be doing a TV commercial. And I'm a bit nifty with a camera. So I kind of got in contact with the company who was doing the commercial and agreed with them would I be able to come along as an additional photographer to document the commercial. Now the thing was that, my next thing was that my gaining access was not through phishing or not through endpoints and not through penetration testing. It was actually physically going through supply chain as the role of photographer. Now, I've done a lot of penetration testing over the years, and I've done this maybe going back 6+ years ago. And as the time came up, one of the things was I usually normally pass the attack pass on to another team who does the red teaming or does the on-site side, and they do those activities. But unfortunately, I was left with having to do this one myself. And the night before, I'm sitting having a drink with a friend. I was telling him, this is my plan tomorrow. Am I going in as a photographer to do this penetration test? And it wasn't until then when I realized when he said, what if they recognize you? Because I hadn't realized at that point when you become a bit of a public figure and you speak at 100 so conferences per year and you publicize and you're on TV and so forth, you start being visible. I started sweating. I started freaking out the night before. I'm thinking that all of a sudden I now need to do something with my appearance. I need to put a disguise on, put a wig or a hat so I actually I didn't sleep well the night before I was going in to do this penetration test. And I started, thinking about it. I was up early in the morning. I was looking in the mirror. How do I make it so that people don't recognize me? So I ended up putting on an old rugged T-shirt, trying to look like a photographer, dressing down a little bit, and got into the vehicle with the commercial team, and we went across. Now, the physical security of the power station was impressive. You had a 5-minute window to access the gate. If you arrived 1 minute before, 1 minute after, you had armed guards coming to you. You had to provide all the details of the car, the vehicle, who was in the car, the time you're arriving, and then you get access to the gate. You had to go through the safety controls first, so the safety aspects of what you can touch, what you can't touch, static control doors, and so forth. Now, as we got through, and of course now I'm in the power station, not as a user, a compromised user, but I'm there as a guest. I'm actually there physically in the power station. And it changed my penetration test quite significantly because normally I'm looking through operating systems and looking through logs and looking at ways to exploit the applications that they have. Now I'm basically physically there. Now one of the things was that as I'm going through, normally, as I mentioned, my network scanning would be, of course, using things like Nmap. Now one of the things that you would think about is it's important to note when I'm doing penetration testing, my method is not to introduce anything new in the network. I will always use the software and the solutions, the applications that the companies are using themselves. So they're using things like System Center, PowerShell, SNMP. They're using their own vulnerability scanners. They're using their own SIEMs. I will use those and actually hide myself in their own applications because introducing anything new increases the risk of being detected. So you prefer to actually just go into the network, basically under legitimate traffic. So, a myth of Kali. Kali's great for using offsite, but you will never introduce Kali into someone's network. You'll always do those processing activities offsite. The only time I've ever brought Kali into a company's environment is when they're actually not managing it themselves, and therefore I need to manage it for them. So some of the challenges you end up facing. So I'm actually going through, my network scanning is walking around the power station. I'm there with a camera, and I've got my back pocket, I have a couple of duckies, bash bunnies, I have different USB keyloggers, all in my backpack, and I'm taking photographs. So I'm walking through. Now, one of the challenges was that I found a few minor things in the engine room, which was that I could actually physically go and change the valve pressure and the lubricant and everything into actually each engine individually. But the problem was that that required physical access and having to access every single engine individually as well. So it was a risk, but it wasn't something that I considered significant. And I was looking through for ports to access. I was looking for cables that I could get access to. But as everything was cabled, all the cables were in pipes, so I couldn't physically access. And all of the actual equipment was actually closed off with metal doors, so I couldn't access those either. So as I went through the network scanning and looking around, taking photographs, and then of course the commercial moved into the command and control, and then the PLCs and the SCADA controls. Now, of course, this was a modern power station, so the SCADA controls were the latest technologies. They had advanced threat protection on them, stickers. They were quite expensive, high security measures. And I'd already kind of done the research beforehand, so I'd already done the emulations and knew the software and done the preparation and planning. So, but the problem was, again, I was going through, all the actually PLC doors and cabinets were locked with keys. I couldn't access them. All the cables were kept away from basically access. And even the desktops where the actually command and control stations were sitting, all of the cabinets with the PCs and the computers were all also kept locked and sealed. So I was getting to get frustrated, and I'm still looking around. I'm looking at the control systems to see about the operating systems, what icons I could see, taking photographs, and trying to understand about what versions of software, what things I could use to exploit. Maybe I can gain access another way. So I was still looking through, and I was actually at this point getting a bit frustrated. I was actually really trying to elevate my privileges. I'm there as a guest, and I'm now trying to elevate my access to being able to do more. Now, I was this is probably about 2/3 of the way through the first day. It was around 2, 3 in the afternoon, and I'm there, and I started basically kind of giving up at that point because all of a sudden all the security I was going through, the physical type of security was impressive. And then just out of the blue, out of nowhere, I was just started reading random pieces of paper. And sitting on the table was a piece of paper with every single username, password, IP address, and URL. Now, all the research I'd done beforehand using the documentation emulators, I can immediately already tell that it was the default credentials because it was exactly the same as the ones I'd used to gain access to the emulation software. And I'm standing there, I'm looking at it, and it's 4 years old, since the actual manufacturer's installation implementation. I was looking at the username and administrator password for the SCADA control systems that had advanced threat protection. You're thinking about that when we actually go through these processes, and sometimes you're thinking about the most difficult, the most challenging, most sophisticated scenario. But in most of these cases, we always forget about the most basic things, the simplest items. And even, people tell us all the time is that most people forget to change the default credentials. Most people put into tests or put into these pilot or UAT environments, and then simply they turn it into production. But actually, when they're going through those processes, they don't go through the security controls or practices to make sure it's configured correctly. And this is the most common practice. Now, one of the mistakes I made was, I thought this was the winning ticket, the golden penetration test, and I thought I'm going to go to the executive board, present this, and they'll all be thank you, and carrying me on their shoulders and going hooray. That was my expectation. The mistake that I made was that I actually stopped doing the penetration test at that point. I should have continued. I should have done more. That's actually my lesson learned for myself was that when you think you've got the winning ticket, don't stop. Don't start basically kind of stopping at that point. Keep looking for the next vulnerability. Keep looking for the next exploit. Keep looking for continuous access. Now, one of the things was that, so the next few days later, myself and the CISO got together, and we were there to present what our findings was to the board. Now, some of the findings that of course, was the controls on the engines, One is the supply chain was a major vulnerability. They weren't doing background checks in the supply chain into who was coming into the power station. They just knew it was going to be 4 people in the vehicle. Who they were, they didn't check. They didn't check my backpack. They didn't look at USBs, at bash bunnies, at all different types of devices in my bag. I had SDRs with antennas coming out of the backpack. They didn't check and they didn't cover things because they thought that's a photographer, it's a camera person, that's part of his equipment. So they didn't do proper background checks in the supply chain. And of course the default credentials, basically it was there for 4 years, that anyone who the vendor, consultants, contractors, engineers that had access to the facility have knowledge and was similar to those of others who actually had the same implementation. Now when we presented to the board, the CISO that I was presenting with, their goal was to get more budget. They wanted more budget to actually do more in the coming year. Now, as we presented, we said, your cybersecurity is horrible, all these vulnerabilities and risks. We went with a fear approach. We went with all the statistics about the World Economic Report, all the things you hear about Black Hat and DEF CON, everything that the vendors throw at you. That's what we went with the board. And the board went and had the concession, they came back and they presented back the findings and who got the budget and who didn't. And we were told the risks were minimum. Thank you for your time. Your presentation was great. However, your budget's been declined. And I was in shock. I was thinking, what did we do wrong? And at the end, the CFO and the CEO came to us and they said, we need to talk to you because we need this to work. And this was the greatest moment in my kind of career, was that having a CEO coming, being direct and honest with me. They said that you actually talked about fear, you talked about risks and threats and vulnerabilities, and you talked about technology, you talked about solutions. You didn't talk about the cost. You didn't talk about the ROI. You didn't talk about the investment. You didn't talk about how it's going to help employees be successful. Our job in cybersecurity is not to solve cybersecurity. Our job in cybersecurity is to make employees be successful doing their jobs with technology. That's our job. And the realization was that the CEO and CFO said, we need this to work. We have another meeting next week with the board. Go off, and you'll have an opportunity to present again next week. So the next week we went back and we represented the new risks to the board. Of course, we found more vulnerabilities in the time that we had and gained access using the credentials. So we were able to present more findings. But we didn't talk about cybersecurity once. We talked about, this is the cost of doing nothing. This is the cost that's going to do of doing something. This is the gap in the risk. This is what your insurance covers you for. This is how it's going to make your employees much safer and be more successful doing what they're doing. How we communicate to the CISO and the technology people has to be very different from how we communicate to the board. And at this point in time, the CEO and CFO said, thank you. That's exactly what we wanted. We didn't say cybersecurity once. We talked about business risk, business first, how it's going to help actually return on investment, what it's going to actually save, and the insurance that you're going to actually be able to be covered for in the future. And that's what the boards really listen to, is how it's going to make the company more profitable, more successful, how it's going to make employees happier doing the job they're doing in a much safer way. So we end up getting the business risk was in knowledge. So what it comes down to is we need to start breaking up the term cybersecurity. Cybersecurity we use overly too much. We use it in a very broad spectrum. And our job in cybersecurity is to use our cybersecurity skills not to solve security, but to help reduce the risk of the business. And that's our fundamental goal. My job is not to solve cybersecurity or to put security in place. My job is to look at the business risk and apply security, either my experience knowledge-wise or solutions that will help reduce the business risk. So we need to break cybersecurity, and we need to focus purely on risk going forward, because that's what actually people listen about, that's what makes change, and that's what people accept, is how do I help organizations be successful, and how do I help employees do their jobs safely and actually help them be happier and successful doing what they're doing. So some of the lessons I learned during this is we need to make sure that we take a people-centric approach doing security, is that security needs to be easy to use, and we have to reject complexity. We also, supply chain is a major risk for organizations. Every time I look through doing penetration testing, supply chain is one of my main targets. That's how I look to gain access. If I can't use phishing campaigns, my second option is the supply chain. And in most cases, I will be successful going through that. Multi-factor authentication needs to be a standard default for all privileged access, all email accounts. A password should not be the only thing protecting a SCADA control system from me gaining access. We need to make sure that password is not the only thing protecting critical systems. Automating management of security of privileged accounts. Also, one of the important things is that when I gain access to organizations, one thing that scares me as a penetration tester is employees who talk a lot. Is that when I see an organization that people talk a lot, that it actually raises the risk of me being detected. If you have employees that are not afraid to ask for advice, are not afraid to actually speak when they see something suspicious, that is actually one of the best ways of detecting risks. If somebody sees something in their machine, what we do is today we punish people too easily for actually clicking in something, and we punish them, we victimize them. We need to stop doing that. We need to empower employees to be actually one of the best protections in the front line. We need to make sure that they're not afraid to talk to their colleagues about, I clicked on something, I think it may have been malicious, what should I do? Those are the organizations that I get detected much more than it is technology and systems. It's the people. And yes, security can only be successful if we focus on the business first. So ultimately, I do have many books that's available. I do have a Cybersecurity for Dummies, which was an award-winning book last year. But in this particular case, The Privileged Account Management for Dummies is a book that has had almost 50,000 downloads and readers. So if it's something you're interested in learning about the subject, feel free. It's a free book. You can go and download it and get some hopefully value from the book itself. So at that point in time, I'd like to thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions or not, or the tea's already getting cold. But I will be around for most of the rest of today. If you do have questions about this or more technical details or more information about the more depth side of things, I'll be happy to answer those throughout the day. So thank you for your time.